Hi. So we're talking about racism, and there's something I really want you to understand, and that's I'm racist, you're racist. The guy next door, racist. Your favorite aunt, racist. And I think it's really a sad fact that we're just not talking about this enough, and we really should be, because the way our brain is designed, we take in information from so many sources. And in situations, our brain has to take all of that information and very quickly provide us just the highlight of all that data that we're taking in order for us to have a reaction in every situation that we're in. And these little highlights, they're called schemas. And it's like you see something that has four legs, it's low to the ground, has a big tail, and your brain goes dog. Okay. And it might not be a dog, but that gives you enough information usually to react appropriately to like the things that are going on. And so we need our brain to do that. But we also live in a society that is shit at seeing human beings as equal and valuable and like able to that every human being is equally able to participate in being a human and should be treated as such, right? So all of the information we get about people and their value and their traits and how they communicate and what we might expect from them comes from pop culture. It comes from the way our grandparents talked about it. It comes from shitty messages in our history books when we were, going through school. It comes from overhearing the grown-ups talk about things going on in society, including things like houselessness, or if you're my age, you would have grown up hearing the older people talking about AIDS when that was ripping through communities, and it helps us form these subconscious biases. And that doesn't make you a bad person. But if we can't talk about how our brains do that, if we can't be aware of it and accept that we have racial biases that harm people and can influence the way we act in a harmful way for people, if we can't acknowledge that, then how do we move forward to a place where we're consciously deciding that we are not going to act on those biases? Because if you and I were to talk about, like, for example, I live in Edmonton, and if you ride the bus here, you've probably noticed that, particularly since the pandemic, there is an ever increasing population of unhoused people on transit. And there's also a lot more overdoses, there's a lot more, so forth and so on. And if you've noticed that, you've probably also noticed that unhoused folks are quite often Indigenous and like ridiculously overrepresented in the unhoused population. And so your brain starts to put those two things together as if they're immutable connections. And so when you are on the bus and you see someone Indigenous get on the bus, you might automatically be assuming unhoused, poverty, mental health, addiction, there's going to be a problem. But if you stop and you think about that intellectually, you're going to be like, oh, that's okay. So, yes, we definitely have a problem in Edmonton with not supporting particularly Indigenous people to support them in becoming housed when they've hit shit times. Um, Absolutely. It is a fact that we have a growing unhoused population. You can talk to Boyle Street, like these things are true. But what's also true is that one, not all unhoused people are struggling with addiction, mental health issues, or are Indigenous. Two, not all Indigenous people are struggling with being unhoused or have mental health issues or addiction. And three, even if they are unhoused, Indigenous, and struggling with mental health or addiction, which I kind of think those two things should be one term, um, they're not necessarily going to be an issue. And their behavior doesn't necessarily going to be something that you have to, be concerned about. And so if we intellectualize it, it's like, oh, okay, that's fine. And then we can take that even further And intellectually, we can be like, why are Indigenous people grossly overrepresented in the unhoused population? And by the way, in every population in Canada that is experiencing challenges. So, poverty, um, mental health crises, addiction, being unhoused, being in prison. Why, when they're one of the smallest demographics in this country, are we seeing so many of them being represented in these socially shitty experiences that we wouldn't wish on anybody? Why? And then we can start looking at how our historically we've created a system that really has supported incarceration and the removal of resources from Indigenous people. And so, you add intergenerational trauma and violence and loss of culture and loss of family. And um, are we surprised? I mean, if you remove all the resources that help someone be resilient and go through life in a place of empowerment, obviously they're going to be disempowered. And we've managed to do that in 150 years of colonizing Canada. We've created the system that's not fair to people who are Indigenous. Like it sucks and it's not fair and it's true. But I can't get to that cognitive process where I'm going, oh, why is this happening? Because it's not the fault of the person who is unhoused, who is experiencing higher rates of incarceration, who is experiencing higher rates of domestic violence and mental health and addiction. It's not their fault. It's the fault of society that has removed all those resources. So if we can't get to that part, then we start to assume it's because they're Indigenous that they're experiencing more unhoused situations, and that's messed up. And that's when we start to have shitty reactions to people, or we start to remember things differently, create a different narrative than the one that's factual, where we're removing resources from supporting unhoused people. And point in fact, that is what Alberta has done over the last few years, is removed resources from the Indigenous communities, and from the entire unhoused population. And the entire population has experienced so much trauma that they are struggling with addiction and so forth and so on. We've removed those resources, which is why we're seeing an increased unhoused population at a time when we're also seeing a really dramatic increase in inflation, which puts even more pressures on people. It makes them struggle to be housed. And I know this because I lost my house over the pandemic because of those stressors. And I'm just privileged enough, I'm able to move into a rental. So there's that. The point is, we have racial biases. So when we start to see those things put together, and we've heard shitty things without context as we were growing up, like, we're going to create these little shortcuts in our brain. And if we're not aware that we have a tendency to be racist, because brains work that way, the schemas, right? And because we're in a society that has taught us to be racist, then we can't do that cognitive piece, right? We can't be aware that the way we're voting impacts people in a way that perpetuates that racial status quo. We can't be aware that even simple decisions we make, right? Where we're going to shop, who we're going to support, who we sit beside on the bus, like these things create a huge effect that impacts people, because we're racist. So we have to be aware and do that thought process if we're ever going to make things better. Anyways, this is Angel. I'm a racist, actively working to be more and more aware of those racial biases so that I can do better. And I hope that's what you want to do too.